Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a second. Thank you. Okay, everyone, I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to our Analyzing President Biden's First 100 Days panel. This event is part of the Institute of Politics, which is a student organization dedicated to engaging and inspiring students to pursue careers in public service as well as politics. My name is Catherine, and I am the director of the Speaker Series program. I've been a part of this team for the last 3 years, and this year I am a graduating senior. So I just wanted to take this time to say thank you to everyone who made this event possible and for everyone who is able to attend today. Our panel is a very esteemed group of guests today. We're joined here today by Dr. Greg Brown from the Kenan Institute. He's also a professor, and Dr. Deborah Stroman of the Gillings School of Public Health, and Professor Rick Sue of UNC Law School, as well as our moderator today, Rob Scofield, Director of NC Policy Watch. They are here today to share their perspectives on some of President Biden's most recent actions as part of his 100 days, as well as reflecting on how things are going so far. So, and we'll be welcome to ask questions during the latter half of the event, and we prefer you to use the chat feature to do so, and they'll be answered time permitting. So let's go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Catherine. Thank you all for being with us. I appreciate anybody who's got the stick-to-itiveness and energy to join an event talking about politics on such a beautiful evening in the springtime of North Carolina. So I know we've got a dedicated audience. Thanks so much for being with us, and to anybody who's watching the recording later. I am Rob Scofield. I direct a project called North Carolina Policy Watch, ncpolicywatch.com. We are a news and commentary organization that has a lot of full-time working journalists who report on state policy issues in North Carolina and indeed around the country. I get to do mostly commentary. I'm sort of a full-time pontificator, both at ncpolicywatch.com and on the radio and on TV. And so I especially enjoy the opportunities I have where I don't have to say what I think, I just get to ask the questions. So for me, this will be an especially relaxing and fun event. The pressure will be on our distinguished panel. So, I noted when I was preparing that I think we're actually only on day 98, right? We're talking about the first 100 days. So it's entirely possible that everything we say will be invalidated over the next 48 hours. Perhaps all kinds of amazing things will happen. Probably not. But it is sort of interesting that this is a common topic that's discussed almost invariably at the commencement of new presidencies, probably dating back to at least the Franklin Delano Roosevelt first administration in 1933. There was an interesting column by Doyle McManus, who is a veteran journalist who wrote a column. He's with the Los Angeles Times. It actually ran today in Raleigh's News and Observer. And he talked about that. He talked about how it's invariable that we have these assessments and debates about the first 100 days of presidencies. He pointed out in his column, perhaps the main point he was making is what an amazingly dramatic difference there is between the first 100 days of the Biden presidency and the first 100 days of the Trump presidency, both, of course, both substantively and stylistically. But it's an interesting read, and that perhaps is a good point for us to start off here talking about that. I guess so delighted that we have this panel. And I guess the first question I want to ask y'all, and y'all should, of course, feel free to delve into the areas that are your own special expertise, but talk to us about, what is your overall take on the first 100 days? And are there noteworthy comparisons to be made to past administrations? Why don't we start with Dr. Stroman?
Well, thank you. And thank you to the Institute for inviting us, and certainly to my co-panelists to be able to join you tonight for this conversation. But I'm actually mixed. I think I'm mixed on this first 100 days. Leading a country that is so divided politically, spiritually, economically, and trying to as some would say, just lean on his, what they call the old liberalism, which I don't believe that's who Joe Biden is. And certainly he hasn't demonstrated that over the past 100 days, in my opinion. But, just considering the different, what's going on politically, right? The Reds trying to figure out whether or not they want to continue President Trump's directive. And then you've got the Blues, which has a bigger lift because it is the umbrella party. And there's so many different interests within that party. And so he's working during a time period when you have to try and figure out a way to try and carve your path. And I think he is in legacy mode, right? He knows that this could be his big opportunity to make a statement and go down like a President Johnson with the Great Society, or President Roosevelt with the New Deal. So I'm mixed. That's where I am right now. That's the type of perspective that I see.
And you mean mixed on the actual performance?
Yes.
That the new administration has?
Yeah, so my grading of his performance right now, I would say it's mixed.
Okay. Professor Sue, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that to a lot of degrees. I think what Biden is trying to do right now, I think is correct. I think he's trying to determine what his legacy is. But I think in connection to that, I think he's trying to figure out where he's going to be able to make that significant mark. Because the president could do a lot. And certainly in the last 2 decades or so, we've really sort of got the blossoming of the imperial presidency. And we imagine that the president's going to come in and do things. But the truth of the matter is anything significant is going to rely on Congress. And I think Joe Biden is trying to figure out where he can build the coalitions in order to do the big things that will actually leave that lasting legacy. And I would say, a lot of the policies he has that he's been focusing on recently does seem to have political support, right? Especially with Republicans sort of discovering, sort of gearing towards a populist sort of standpoint, focusing on spending, economic investment, those kind of things. They have broad support. But there are wedge issues. And I think those are the ones that Biden has been shying away from. And immigration is one of them. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more later. But that's one of those issues, I think, that there is not a clear consensus. There is a very deep cleavage. And I think Biden realizes that he's in some ways in trouble there, right? So I think he's trying to figure out where he can make his mark as early as he can before the midterm elections. And I think there are some issues that are being put in the back burner precisely because they are sort of political red meat, if you will, and he knows it.
And Professor Brown's batting cleanup for us. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we try to evaluate things from the economic perspective, it's things are very positive right now. The economy is really lifting off. I mean, I guess the question is how much of that is due to the Biden administration? I think some of it is, in the sense that I think people have probably more confidence in, I would say, a transparent policy. Maybe that's a nice neutral word coming out of the Biden administration, and an understanding of how to conduct, policy that's going to be unequivocally positive for prospects going forward. Certainly, the stimulus bill is going to have a direct impact. Probably hasn't just yet because the money's just kind of going out the door now. But certainly anticipation of a fairly significant additional stimulus package that will continue to support the economy. And of course, I think just getting the pandemic increasingly under control is a huge positive for the economy. I mean, I've just noticed that in terms of going out. I mean, my own personal behavior, but also just seeing what other people are doing. It does look like there's a lot of optimism around economic kind of return to economic normal at this point. So there's a lot more in the works, though. Certainly, the infrastructure bill, other proposed legislation in terms of kind of getting into longer term issues around climate, around dealing with inequalities, economic inequalities, and other inequalities that we're expecting to hear more about this week. Those are going to be interesting. The approach to things so far seems to be. I'm curious what the other panelists think about this. And you as well, Rob, in terms of how he's approaching the political. I mean, certainly when we looked at the stimulus bill, one of the things the progressives really wanted to have in that was a $15 minimum wage, and it feels like that got pulled out pretty quickly because it was controversial, and you know, it would be a fight from just a rules and regs standpoint, I guess, in terms of how legislation is done to try to keep that in. And so I think they put that for a fight for another day. I also think there's a lot of disagreement even among moderates as to whether that's a viable good policy for for the economy broadly. And so I think those are things that are going to be litigated down the road, and it'll be interesting to see how economic policy evolves as we get into some of these thornier, more controversial issues.
It was interesting that he did take that baby step today by issuing an executive order on the minimum wage, at least as it would apply, a $15 minimum wage applying to federal contractors. But obviously, that's just a small part of the universe when it comes to the American workforce. I wonder what y'all think about the issue of, we talk about bipartisanship, we talk about coalitions. Professor Sue mentioned. Is that even a reality, a real possibility in 2021? It seems increasingly clear that I've yet to see what the issue would be that he's been able to attract Republican votes on any significant matter. It seems that the Republican members of Congress remain pretty much still loyal to the Trump version of America on so many issues. I wonder, Professor Sue, you mentioned that coalitions. I mean, is a coalition even something that's realistic, or are we just to the point where voters just want the job to get done and they don't care how it gets done?
Yeah, I think, really the trend of sort of hyper-partisanship, I think really starting with the Obama administration means that when it comes down to the vote, we're probably going to get split right down the party line. And I think Biden realizes that, right? And I think in some ways, unlike what Obama tried to do, he talks bipartisan, but he's not necessarily wedded to getting bipartisan support. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I think Biden realizes, and I think you're seeing this a little bit, that one thing that has happened with the Trump administration is that certain issues, right, actually has support from some of the Republican base, right? Some of the sort of economic issues when it comes to spending, when it comes to even minimum wage to some degree, there are Republicans coming out sort of saying we should increase the minimum wage. I think, the sort of old school pro-business, now they're kind of going against those big businesses, right? So I think he realizes that even if it comes down to the vote, he may not get it, but these policies are popular. And the Republicans are not coming back, they're coming back with something smaller, but they're not necessarily saying, no, we shouldn't have a stimulus, or no, we shouldn't do something about economic equality or monopolies or trust or whatever, right? They're all on that. So he realized, I think those are good for him. I think there are, however, some issues that Republicans wish he would move on, right? Because, you can see what the governors are doing, right? Because the governors are running for presidents right now. So looking at what the governor's doing, focusing on, sort of anti-police reform, anti-protest, anti-sanctuary cities, right? They, transgender sort of bans. They want the issue back to that, right? And one thing that's really interesting is Biden, despite the promises he made to the progressive base, maybe strategically or whatever Biden is, hasn't been focusing on those issues as much, right? At least not in a way that I think the Republicans would like that, because they want that fight to be over there, right? But actually, I think a lot of the economic issues, the traditional left-right divide has eroded, and I think Biden wants to capitalize on that in a kind of FDR kind of way.
So Rick, can I ask you a question, a follow-up question on that? I mean, do you think that that's part of sort of an optimal strategy in terms of trying to get as much that is agreeable out of the way first before you tackle some of these harder issues? Or
yeah, I think so. And I think in some ways, I think, going back to even what Deborah has said a little bit earlier, I think even in Biden's hearts of hearts, I think, some of the economic issues, the labor issues, those kind of things are probably what Biden feels most comfortable with, though that, he had to sort of turn around and do the more sort of progressive line on, to sort of go through the primary. So it could be strategic, or it just maybe that's where Biden's comfort zone is. But I think Biden realizes that the midterm is going to be problematic. And in some ways, what he does in the first 100 days, or really the first 2 years, right, or a year and a half, let's say, right, leading up to the election, is going to define what that election looks like. And, if it's defined around the economy, right? Which is what Trump wanted as well. I think he thinks that's going to do well. So
I would also add that considering what's happened over the past 12 years, lessons have really, really been learned. And, President Obama came in, following his mandate from his voter base,
Right.
and he tried to cross the aisle, and it was not very effective.
Right.
And remember, as we all know, President Biden was a part of that. And then President Trump comes in and says, it's my way or the highway. And the Reds just followed along. And there we have the Blues sitting there on the sideline watching and bummed and upset and all of that, trying to figure out who they are. And then President Biden, now he's president, I think he's going to not bother with bipartisanship, but we know his history that he wants to do that. He wants to have everybody play fair, kumbaya. But I think he's learned, and I think he's being informed by people who say, don't bother. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. I saw in an article the other day, a researcher stated that on average, political conservatives experience fear more intensely, And so then that makes me think of the policy, the behavior, the attitudes to scare people, and get that sense of fear going in the country. And I think a number of people believe that we're in a nation right now where everybody's on edge about everything. And if you feel that way, then that's going to manifest in policy, as in those immigrants are just coming to take your jobs, or the progressives, they just want to get rid of all the police, officers.
Take away your guns.
Yes, and it works. And it works. And so you have President Biden trying to manage this. How do I bring about, we know love is more powerful than fear. How do we create that in a time period when people are, sitting in their spots in terms of, I'm looking out for my own best interest?
So Professor Stroman, one point that obviously comes to mind, and the fact you've offered this assessment that kind of mixed on what he's been able to accomplish or what he's championed so far. How the heck does he get this? His situation that he confronts is so narrowly divided in Washington. His margins are so thin, and as a practical matter, there may still be a working conservative majority in the U.S. Senate, maybe even the House too, really ideologically. What more could he be doing to move things along, to just do away with any fanciful notions that we're going to sing Kumbaya?
Well, if I had that answer, I'd be one of those $1 million consultants in DC right now.
Okay.
But, clearly you have to take advantage of the moment. And so when we have these major disturbances in our country, everything from George Floyd being murdered, to, COVID-19 situations where you have to be ready to respond with a plan. You can't wing it. You have to take advantage of that moment. And then the other thought is to not be so concerned. We're going to have more conversation, more dialogue around the filibuster. But I really think that he's got to go with his base and hope that, I think it's Arizona and West Virginia, some conservative Democrats to try and say, look, we need you right now. We learned our lessons over the past 12 years, but don't bother trying to shake hands and, break bread. The nation is clearly divided, and I don't know if it's President Biden is the one that can bring us back together. It might take a natural disaster to do something, or more of the coronavirus. But it's really sad, the situation that we're in right now, considering we have so much in common, but yet we're just going on these, differing paths.
Yeah, at the outset of the administration, Biden Chief of Staff Ron Klain identified 4 overlapping and compounding crises that would clearly be at the top of the agenda for the administration: the pandemic, the economic downturn, the climate emergency, and the national reckoning over racial equity in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. And of course, this isn't a static situation. We've had a lot of developments just in the last few weeks. We've had a horrific development here in North Carolina in the just epidemic of police shootings that are taking place. And I wonder, is this is this obviously is going to have an impact, right? The changing situation is has an impact on his ability to get things done. It's also true with what's going on. I'm sure Professor Sue would talk about what's going on right now in the immigration world and the issues at the southwest border, and whether that is a huge problem for the administration. Talk to us, whoever wants to go, about how things, just the events that have happened just since he took office 98 days ago, are influencing his ability to continue to control the picture.
Yeah, I'll start with that. I think that's right. You know, one thing that's really interesting, I think, is how much, even before he became president, when he was running for president, how many of the major issues that he was going to be dealing with were reactive, right? That things were happening. There was already a crisis in effect that he is going to have to deal with, right? So this is not a presidency where you're going to come in with a vision, you know, on a blank slate, and this is what I want to put in. You know, what people want, and the biggest issues is, can you solve the crisis happening right now? And I think one thing that we have to remember for the first 100 days, especially I think for the Biden administration, is how much he is in some ways putting back together or restructuring the federal administration, right? I mean, look, every presidential transition, right? You're going to put in your people, you got to sort of put them in places, but especially, you know, in certain contexts, and immigration is one of them, right? I mean, you know, his sort of flip-flopping that people are mad about keeping the refugee numbers low. Part of it is politics, but part of it is that the infrastructure, I think he's right, had been gutted, right? I mean, the infrastructure just does not exist, right? I mean, you know, in 3 years of such low numbers, right? I mean, most of that is state and local sort of support in refugee resettlement. That's not there anymore. And that was a concern that was raised when Trump was sort of lowering the numbers and then therefore taking away the federal funding that supports that. We're going to lose these people and they're not going to come back. And now we're seeing it. So I think a lot of it is, I think there's three things, right? One, he's reacting to these situations. The second is that he has to build up an administration to at least show some idea that the government might be able to do something, that there's some competence. And then, of course, trying to retool so that they follow some sort of presidential administration policy. Immigration is always interesting because the truth is most of those enforcement agents aren't really that responsive to presidential directives. I mean, that's a problem that's been going on for a long time, right? And then I think the third thing, going back to Dr. Stroman's sort of earlier remark, I think if there is one thing right now, it's, can he reframe people's feeling about institutions and politics away from the sense of division and fear into something where, and this is the thing there, we've been talking a lot about policy, but I also feel this is a strange moment in American politics where actually policy is not the biggest dividing line, right? It's not the biggest dividing line between the parties. It's not really what's forefront on people's minds, right? It's the sense of like disaffection. It's the sense of fear. It's really driven by that much. And I think, you know, Biden's success is whether or not he can actually sort of bring it back to normal, whatever the normal is, or whether or not he's going to have to harness this somehow to get things done.
It's clear, Professor Sue, that the immigration issue has been the one thing that the Biden's opponents have seized on and have elevated as, I gather they think this is one of his Achilles heels. They're making, you know, I get emails every day from conservative groups lambasting the administration for its terrible performance at the southwest border. It's interesting because, of course, Trump rose to power, you know, making such a big deal out of immigration, and then it kind of went away. He lost interest in it to an extent, and indeed he ended up winning surprising support from a lot of Latino voters in the election, particularly Latino men, and yet now it's back. Is this purely just a cynical act by his opponents? Do you think there's any real concern about what's going on there, or is this just pure politics?
Yeah, I think the Southwest border, and this is part of the reactive thing I was talking about right before, which is that Biden could have anticipated the surge, but in some ways it wasn't entirely on his radar, right? The solutions that he has sort of put forward and his sort of perspective that he wants to put forward, those are long-term goals. But this is not something that he can directly control in terms of how many people are going to show up. at the border, sort of seeking asylum in that regard. And of course, part of the reason that people are coming to seek asylum, and part of the reason why it's the numbers are so big and problematic, is because we take a long time processing them, right? The infrastructure for going through asylum claims, which he has some great, decent, good ideas, right, of how to sort of speed that up, just isn't there right now, right, in that regard. But on the other hand, I want to say this, right, which is quite interesting. You know, one thing that the census showed as well is, and this is not unusual in American history, if we're worried about immigration as like, you know, immigration as an issue, we're probably at the lowest point of immigration right now in recent history. If we're worried about unauthorized immigration, we're at net negative right now. There are estimated more unauthorized immigrants leaving the country than coming in, right? So there were points in time when immigration was, like, just by the numbers, a truly staggering and problematic issue, right? But objectively, one might say, right, you know, the surge is certainly an issue, especially for the unaccompanied minors in our asylum process. But there is a solution to that, right, which is a sort of processing for asylum. You know, in terms of like immigration itself, like that is something that I think people are upset about, of what happened, let's say 20 or 30 years ago. But it's not really necessarily a big issue now. So I think a lot of that actually floats into, and I don't want to get cynical, but it plays into a certain script, and it plays into a certain fear, and it plays into a certain fear of something that's in some ways already happened, right? In some regards. So.
Well,
Well, we
I
know
think
that. Go
this is
ahead, Deborah.
higher
I'm sorry.
education, and we cannot, I can't let this go further without making sure that we remind ourselves that it's not just slow processing at the border. The United States is guilty of interfering with these countries in terms of economics, in terms of politics, in terms where our hands are very, very dirty. You don't have to believe me, you know, do your own research. But one of my favorite podcasts on this is Malcolm Gladwell's. If you're not listening to Malcolm Gladwell's, the revisionist history podcast, please do so. And he has an excellent podcast on this. I think it's called General, I'll forget the name. I'll get it to you though, but please listen to that podcast. But the reason why many, many people are rushing to our borders is because of what we've done and not done in these countries.
An excellent point. Professor Brown, there's the issue of the economy. It's usually stated that, you know, as go jobs, as goes the economy, so go elections. There's a lot of people who think that were it not for what the pandemic did to the economy, and obviously a lot of other things, that Trump might well have easily won re-election. Is this Biden's ace in the hole, or his hope for preserving his administration and further political success going forward is, okay, the economy's kind of gotten back together, there's hope there, there's optimism, everything else will fall into place if that keeps moving forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the real issue currently is there's not really one economy. There's multiple economies out there, and so, you know, we look what happened in the pandemic. I mean, people call this a K-shaped recession for the first time, because there were people that did extremely well. So people that could work from home, people that had wealth, either financial wealth or real estate wealth, have actually done really well. We had one of the largest, if not the largest, increase in household wealth happen over the last year. But again, it's extremely concentrated, right? It's, you know, the top, you know, 10%, 5%, 1% that's accumulating the vast majority of this wealth. If you look what's happened to lower income households and less skilled workers, they've really been decimated. And, you know, it's you know, huge unemployment, obviously, much of it in the non-essential kind of away from home service sector, which tends to break towards women and underrepresented minorities. So, you know, it's a very different economic situation for people sort of, you know, below median household income than above median household income. So I think the question is, you know, what does that mean for political prospects? It probably means, like, what does the recovery mean for those households, right? Are they people that are going to be able to get back to work, to start, you know, rebuilding wealth? How do they feel about that? I mean, if the economic recovery ends up being widespread, then that would be a good thing, you know, for midterm elections and Biden going forward. But I think it's very unclear what's going to happen there. I mean, just one example is we saw more than 5 million people leave the workforce, are still out of the workforce. And a lot of that is because of necessity. They either have family reasons or they have health risks that force them out of the labor force. So, what happens to those people? Are they going to be destitute? Are they going to be able to come back into the workforce? What are their prospects when they come back? There's been a shift in the overall economic activity in the country. The economy is going to look different. Some of those people are not going to have the skills that they need to be reemployed or reemployed at the same level that they left. So, I mean, there's a lot of questions about not just the level of economic activity, but the specifics, how individual households are going to be affected.
It's one of the vexing things for those of us who take a progressive point of view on a lot of these issues, that it seems that on economic issues, this has been alluded to previously, that polling shows that public opinion is generally with a much more progressive approach towards taxation of the rich, towards corporations paying their fair share, towards wages, towards the social safety net. There are very few issues in which significant majorities don't favor a much more progressive approach than has been pursued, and than even perhaps than the president is proposing. But for whatever reason, it never seems to be realized. There doesn't seem to be a way to translate that public opinion into actual votes on the bills that matter in Congress. And it doesn't. I mean, do you see any chance that that's going to change?
Well, we're going to have some test cases here. I mean, I think the corporate tax rate is a big one. And while there may not be a big move towards bipartisanship, it's still a fragile majority that he has. So the moderates have a lot of power in terms of making policy right now. So there's already been resistance to taking the corporate tax rate back to where it was, and Democratic senators suggesting a smaller upward revision. So we're just going to see what the political appetite is for some of these issues.
Yeah, it sounds like that the real move there, the real crux of the debate, is less with the actual rate, which I guess was at 35, cut to 21. They're proposing to go to 28, but it's really around these ways that the corporations are sheltering incomes in other nations and finding out ways basically to pay nothing or very little in the way of corporate income taxes, and maybe where the real battle is joined on that.
I think it goes back to marketing and branding. I think the Reds do a wonderful job of staying on message and behind closed doors, taking care of those who don't stay on message. Whereas the Blues, again, it's difficult because you have such a wide range of thought on the moderate to liberal to progressive side, but the messaging is poor. It's absolutely poor. And, time and time again, they just stumble over themselves. And it's almost like the Reds have a sense of long-term planning. And so we're going to take care of this at this point and give us some time. We'll get to your issue, and then give us some time and we're going to get to your issue. But on the blue side, it's, I want mine right now. I have no sense of waiting my turn, or let's work as a team. I'm going to get the ball this quarter and you're going to get the ball the next quarter. There's none of that. And that shows up in terms of policy creation and policy delivery.
As an aside, I have to say, Professor Stroman, I'm old enough to remember when the Reds were actually the good guys. But anyway, we'll lay that aside. But, I guess it's worth noting that while perhaps there is a higher level, perhaps of message discipline and ideological discipline on the conservative side, it's quite arguable that the Trump administration really didn't get much done when it came to they did pass their big tax cut, which basically was a direct handout to folks at the top and the people, the donor class that funded his campaign. But aside from that, it's hard to really point to much in the way of significant policy accomplishments that the Trump administration was actually, even with larger majorities than Biden enjoys now, we're able to get through. I think I'm right about that?
He's not a politician, right? He didn't know how to work with his own, base, I should say politicians. He just came in with, this is what I'm going to do. And you are going to pay consequences if you don't follow along. And again, the power of fear.
But did he really accomplish anything by doing that? I mean, it was clear that he may have said a lot of those things, but in terms of getting bills passed, my recollection is that the number of significant bills the Trump administration actually enacted, they certainly did a lot of things by fiat and executive action and some of it very questionable legality, but they didn't really get much done in terms of
Right,
changing
agreed.
policy.
But I'm saying that was, to me, I expected that.
I see.
I might have a little bit, I mean, you did mention it. So I do think that Trump was very effective, sometimes, stepping out of, I think, even his admitted sort of jurisdictional power and using the executive action to great effect, right? And the reason I say is I think he got into the practice, and I think the administration was very clear that we're going to get challenged on this, and it might get struck down, but we're just going to put so many of those out there so quickly that some of it's going to stick. In either way, right? We're going to get a month, 2 months, 3 months, and then in practice, and just sort of keep it rolling, right? I mean, that was certainly the action that I saw in the immigration realm, where it felt like every week there were 2 things coming down, and it was like, this is clearly not within his power, but it's going to take a while to litigate it, so he's going to do it anyway. The second thing I think that actually is quite interesting is if there is a movement, right? Even though I don't think he was able completely to wrangle, let's say, the Washington establishment, but I would say a lot of the core of party politics, and especially policy and action, is at the state level. And if anything has become very clear, and those majorities are much bigger, right? I mean, the sort of, right, concentrate depending on the state that you're talking about, both sides, right? But I think if anything right now, what you've seen is that his big policy successes were at the state level, right? That he's sort of taken over
Judicial.
and judicial completely, right? And then they go together, right? Because they're sort of in that same line. So I think that's a lot of the actions that were happening in this during the Trump administration was essentially state level actions. And now what we're seeing, right? I mean, Congress is still stalemated on a bunch of things, but state legislatures are really active this session right now, right? With all sorts of preemption laws, with voting rights laws, with anti-protest laws, with anti-defunding law. I mean, on sort of every issue right down the line. And all of them following, I think, a very clear sort of, these were the issues that Trump were focused on, and we'll enact them. Unlikely you're going to get them through Congress, right? I mean, even if they had sort of bare control, right? There's just too many stalemates at Congress. But state legislatures are very active. So I think in some ways that's the biggest legacy that we're seeing. And I would say that's one thing that, I would say about 20, 30 years, Democrats have really not focused that much on state and local politics. That goes into districting, that goes into everything else. But I think it's showing right now. They don't have that infrastructure in the way that the Republicans do. So that's where Trump's action is. It's at the state level.
Professor Brown, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I really personally just wonder what's going on with the Republican Party right now. I mean, it feels very fractured and in a fragile spot. I have a colleague that I work with who's a political insider in DC, lifelong Republican, was in the Bush administration. And after January 6th, he said he'll never vote for another Republican as long as he lives. And so, I mean, it doesn't take a lot of those people, even if it's just 5 or 10% of people that were, kind of old school Republican, people in the moderates that have been completely turned off by the Trump administration. That was a breaking point for them to change. And I mean, I don't follow sort of the political polling enough to know whether this is something that would be influential in elections and changing the composition in the midterms. But I mean, I just wonder what the Republicans are going to do going forward. It feels to me like there's something fundamentally fractured there.
Yeah, I would agree with you at a certain level. And then again, here for instance, in North Carolina, where I watch the North Carolina General Assembly in action, I don't see it as much. There's an interesting leadership there of Senator Berger, Speaker Moore, who've remained essentially loyal to Trump all throughout, but probably not true Trump believers, but mouth the right things to stand next to him when they had to. And they seem to have survived, and obviously they've survived. They continue to dominate state politics. It's an interesting, one wonders whether that will have an influence in North Carolina and places like our state. It's so.
What does it do in the Senate, I guess? I mean, I agree with the state politics being very different, but I mean, what I'm curious about is what does it do to the balance in the Senate where we're 50-50? Right. Are there going to be enough people that back away from Republicans to give, a real majority in the Senate?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, as a general matter, historically, off-year elections like that tend to go against the party in power. So, but these are not very normal times. I wonder, Professor Stroman, you may have a thought about the issue of, there are some progressives, AOC and others on the left in Congress who are taking a stance. Yeah, that's nice, President Biden, but there's a heck of a lot more you need to be doing. You need to be more aggressive. We're not sure, we're going to just be so loyal to you. They want to push aggressively for a much swifter approach to these issues, a much more aggressive take. Is that something you see is likely to be effective, worth pursuing for progressives who are passionate about these issues, not just elected officials, but activists and citizens?
Well, I certainly think that it's healthy for our country for it to happen. It is really, really healthy. And then we have to think about, many of them are looking at research or their own lived experiences in terms of how the policies, because they're not that old, but the policies of the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s did not work for them. And so they've been beating this horse over and over. And of course, the front man for this was Senator Bernie Sanders. And so time and time again, we're not going to the place that we need to go to. That's what progressives are saying. And so it's important for them to continue to have a voice, continue to lift it up. And certainly with so many young people who are frustrated with us older folks who just can't seem to get our act together. And so they are using technology to get engaged, to mobilize, to organize. For the first time, I really started researching and learning about the Democratic Socialist Party. Right? I would have never thought to look at that, right? But because there is so much concern in terms of things that are happening, and we know we have an interesting mix of racism and socioeconomic status, right? That mix there. But you have people with common interests, whether they're low-income whites, whether they're people of color, BIPOC, people are saying we want change, and now is the time to do it, and it can be done. I could, spend a semester or a year talking about all the racial matters that are going on and how we continue to have brown and Black people with the worst outcomes in all of our systems and white people having the best outcomes. Now, are there some exceptions? Absolutely. But overall, that is the fabric of our country. And when are we all really going to work towards change? As in making it better for everyone, lifting up the dignity, the humanity of all people, liberating all brown and Black people, because there is a better way. It can be done. I don't believe in that. What we're taught in Econ 101 about the law of scarcity, where there's only a finite amount of something. There is more than enough. And maybe I'm tapping into my spiritual, thought and my faith, but I do believe there's more than enough, and we can have a better country if more people are doing well. I think
I've seen some interesting analysis that if we merely enacted a surcharge of maybe it was 30 or 40% just on the growth in the wealth of billionaires since the start of the pandemic, just those handful of individuals, that we could literally pay off a huge chunk of what we spent on COVID relief. It's a remarkable, the staggering growth in wealth of the folks at the top right now. And while there have been, statements from the Biden administration really probably that are more progressive than we've heard from an American president on issues of race, on issues of economic justice in many, many decades. And yet translating that into reality still seems like a real uphill battle as we go forward. We're getting close to the end of our time. I guess maybe I'll just ask you all for some closing comments about where we are and what are we looking forward to going forward. There was a question that was asked at another one of these seminars that I saw recently. They said, will we ever get back to a time of quote unquote normalcy in Washington, D.C.? It seems to me perhaps the time of normalcy has passed, but what do you all expect going forward? And can you care to offer any predictions for the next 100 days and maybe the next 1,000 days? Go ahead, whoever feels moved to go first.
Sure, I think the tension's going to continue because as more and more of these policies are proposed and more people respond to it, going with my expertise around racial matters in our country, racial equity and healthcare, hoping that we wake up and we understand that education is not the great equalizer. And I know that's the way we've been socialized and conditioned, but wherever you are on that socioeconomic spectrum, racial disparities exist by race. I mean, there's so much data on that.
Mhm.
In fact, the typical Black family with a graduate or professional degree lags its white counterparts by more than $200,000 in wealth. And so we have to understand that, yes, you can go get your degrees and all of that, but we still have racial disparities. And then when we think about healthcare, understanding that the disparities are present there, very alarming, and they've been documented for decades. Everything from cities, counties, and states saying that racism is a public health crisis, to looking at recent research that Black babies do better when they're cared for by a Black doctor. What does that say? And especially when you look at the numbers of Black physicians.
Mm.
So I'm hopeful that we continue to have tension. I think discomfort is good. I think we all know that on the other side of discomfort is growth. And I'm just hoping that we continue to have this dialogue and bring these issues to the forefront. I'm encouraged. I'm hopeful.
Glad to hear that. Professor Su?
Yeah, so piggyback off on that, going back to your original question of normalcy, right? I think in some ways, maybe we don't want to go back to quote unquote normalcy in Washington, right? Because I think in some ways, the normalcy that we understood certainly was the consensus when I was growing up through sort of the, Reagan into the Clinton, the Bush sort of era, both Bushes, I guess, in that particular regard. I think the certain normalcy was that there were just a lot of views and a lot of positions that were just absent, right? That just wasn't of a concern. I mean, there were sort of big policy fights over sort of search and perspectives, but there was a lot that actually just wasn't sort of seen. And I think as Professor Brown sort of mentioned earlier, I think one thing that I think has become clear is that we're increasingly living in a divided America, not just in terms of ideology or whatever it is, but we're actually living just totally different lives depending on region, depending on race, depending on neighborhood, depending on community, depending on socioeconomic class. Like, even when we have something that is affecting the whole nation, in fact, the whole world, like COVID, the trajectory is completely different, right? Among these sort of different groups. So I think the thing coming out is, can we keep on sort of having that awareness that there are lots of people living a lot of different lives, but not have it be a point of division, but a point of sort of, can you get to some sort of empathy, a bridging, that we can actually see that there are shared concerns, that let's say struggling rural communities have a lot to share, let's say with, struggling inner city communities to some degree, without getting caught in some sort of cultural fight or, sort of racial fight. So that's sort of, I don't know where it's going to go, right? And I think Biden is trying to thread that needle, right? Because this can all easily sort of just get back into a big sort of cultural, racial on all these issues. And I think these are the issues that are really sort of motivating that tension. Whereas this seems to be more and more building common ground on, some of the economic issues and even some of the racial justice issues, right? To some degree, if you don't have people paint it as some sort of, an extreme descent into anarchy or something like that. So I think that it can go either way. I'm not sure I want to go back to normalcy, but whether or not this becomes productive or really degrades into something that may be highly even problematic, I think the beta, if you will, the volatility of where it goes is actually much higher than before, but it could also end up in a much better place.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I really do feel that we're in a different era and we're going to stay in a different era. And probably the most defining characteristic of this is the fact that we're so divided in so many different ways. I mean, I look at it through an economic lens. Certainly, everything Deb said is correct. The differences are greater by race for sure. But the fact is that it's an increasingly large percentage of the population that's being left behind economically, right? And we see this in the data. I mean, you look back the last 3 decades, there's been essentially no real income growth for median households and below, right? It's pretty stunning. Despite the fact there's been tremendous economic growth, tremendous growth in financial wealth, I think this is something that has to change. I don't know how it's going to change. I don't know what the political will is to make it change. But again, I think we're going to see some interesting litmus tests, like, for example, how we treat capital gains, right? I mean, capital gains have been favored from a tax perspective decades, maybe forever. I don't even know the full history there, but certainly for my lifetime. And I think the reason behind that was, oh, well, we need to promote capital formation because that's investment in the economy. It leads to more growth down the road, but that's changed, right? I mean, capital, the world is flush with capital right now. We don't need to provide tax incentives for capital formation. There's just tons of capital, yet we still tax at a lower rate. Is there going to be the political will to even, have tax rates become equivalent between labor income, earned income, and capital gains? I mean, that's a very fundamental issue, but an important one, and one that gets directly at how income and wealth is distributed in the economy. So I'm really curious to see how it's going to go. I wish I understood politics better so I could make a prediction on it. But I think these are the types of issues that we're going to struggle with as a society, and we're going to struggle with from an economic perspective as well.
One issue that is we may get some questions in the chat, but I have more I want to ask, at least a few more, and one that we've only very touched on very superficially, and that was indeed, however, mentioned as one of the 4 crises identified by the administration right at the outset, that seems obviously to have a disproportionate effect, much in the way the economy does, on people of color, the people without property in our society, is the climate emergency. This is a situation. I did a column this week, actually. We do something at NC Policy Watch called Monday Numbers, in which I merely was just reporting on a report that was prepared by a giant Swiss insurance company. Swiss Re is what they're commonly known as, in which the company looked at the likely impact of the climate crisis on the global economy over the next 30 years and made a series of predictions based upon this level of action by government, this level of action, this level of inaction. And they're forecasting, even at a time in which global population will reach 10 billion, that we could see a decline in GDP of 14% over the next 30 years, which is just a remarkable development that bodes very ill for a lot of people and for the overall well-being of the planet. I sense at some degree of growing consensus, although the naysayers remain loud and much like the vaccine deniers, very loud and effective in some respects. We do see business starting perhaps to embrace this concept. Hey, here we have giant insurance companies saying we're going to lose money with this thing. We have the auto industry starting, it seems, to embrace a transition to electrified vehicles. I wonder if any of you, I know this isn't an area of specialty for any of you, but I wonder, you know as much as most people, if you have any thoughts about the climate crisis and what the administration has done, what it might do, whether there's any cause for optimism there.
Well, it's definitely in the bill, the new bill that's coming out. Well, more details, American Families.
Yeah, the jobs plan. Or, yeah.
Mm-hmm. They're definitely going to address this. But again, I put on my racial equity lens, and
right.
Once again, we see the poor outcomes. Nearly 54,000 people of color live near residue effects of uranium.
Right.
Blacks are 3 times more likely to have asthma. I mean, whether it's the oil, the soil, the air, the water, the waste dumps, once again, the others have to suffer through that. And so that's an economic issue, it's a political issue, it's a spiritual issue. But I do like the fact that more people are becoming aware of what is going on with our planet. Humans are damaging the planet. We are killing the planet, and we need to make that a priority. We really do. And I know I've been enlightened in that space more over the past 2 years. I'm really getting involved and learning more about how bad this is. And again, it's not surprising because all systems, we have brown and black people having the worst outcomes and white people having the best outcomes.
Yeah, our environmental reporter, Lisa Sorg at NC Policy Watch, really the best environmental reporter in North Carolina, has written volumes of stories in recent years about environmental justice, everything from sea level rise to hog farms and coal ash to PFAS, how all of them almost invariably disproportionately disadvantage low-income people and people of color. Those are the people who suffer most and first when we talk about all of those environmental problems. I don't
Local.
know.
We
Go
don't
ahead.
have
I'm
to
sorry.
go across the state or United States, right here in Orange County.
Right. She's
Yeah,
going to
I
have a
mean,
story on that on Friday, actually.
I
Go
definitely
ahead.
see, like, I mean, I think it's heartening. I feel like the sort of focus on climate change is really becoming, all the polling show, especially for the younger generations, that this is a major concern. Uh, and I think it's good to tackle it. My fear is that it's still going to have an effect, right? We're already seeing some of the effect, right? I mean,
Like
in fact,
immigration, right?
immigration, exactly, right? I mean, the sort of flow from Central America is in part connected to the drought that they're having. I mean, besides all the political corruption and everything else, right, and all the sort of criminal, sort of deportees that we had sent and everything along with that. So what I'm in some ways concerned about climate change is that if it does have an effect, it won't just be an economic one with insurers, right? This is going to sort of threaten and destabilize in some ways a lot of political institutions and maybe or just basic sense of the nation state. And my concern is this has happened around the same time that actually both sort of institutions in general, but also sort of multinational, international institutions have really saw a decline, right? I mean, I think the response has been to sort of shrink inwards as a result, and I think that sets up a really dangerous and volatile sort of formula if we keep going down that road. Is my sense. I mean, in some ways, the COVID epidemic, you think COVID would be like the best, right? Like, who's for COVID? Everyone's against COVID, right? There are a lot of enemies that there isn't a common enemy. Like, oh, well, we like guns or don't like guns, right? Okay, we can disagree on that. You would think everyone hates a disease, right? Like, they're just not even like, they're not even an animal that's cute and cuddly, right? But even that, in some ways, fractured so many national, international institutions in our way to deal with it. I just don't, so that's a pessimist to me, right? Because
Yeah.
these is, if we do face all the sort of fallout of climate change, all that's going to threaten, economically, politically, socially, all sorts of things that we're used to. And I always say, that the end of the Gilded Age, right, has sort of two things going on. On one hand, we can point to New Deal and FDR and essentially, sort of this rediscovery of like, government as actor. On the other hand, we had a series of world wars, right? I mean, we had, we had all that. And we're in this sort of weird moment where, you could trace similarities, I think, between the 1910s and the 2010s into the 2020s. And again, I don't think it repeats itself, but I think there's something there, right? Both in the economic scene and also the political scene.
And also the legacy. Again, he is concerned about this. I think in the bill, it's about 175 billion towards clean energy. He's talking about his legacy, what he wants to build, what he wants to go out with.
Professor Brown, you have any thoughts about the climate?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue from my perspective is it's a global issue. So, it's something where diplomacy is essential. And we have to have the other most important countries all on the same page, but we just can't solve the problem. So we got to figure out how to work with China and India, with Western Europe. Otherwise, you just can't solve the problem. I think there is a part of it that business needs to be on board, but they're not the ones that's going to be able to solve it. There's all increasing pressure on the business sector from investors. Right? I mean, look at, say, ESG in Europe, right, is a super powerful force right now in the investment community. So businesses are really taking a look carefully at what their stance is on environmental policy, among other issues. That's rapidly moving to North America. I expect it's going to move to Asia and the rest of the world as well. So there's going to be a much greater awareness in terms of what positioning is on important global issues for the business sector. But business can't solve climate change. It's got to be a global political solution. Yeah. And my concern is that even with a sincere effort on the part of the Biden administration, because it's such a long-term problem, and you have instability in the political systems, that it becomes intractable. I mean, our own political system, which is historically one of the most stable, is waffling on climate change. So how do you come up with a 50-year solution in people that are going to commit to doing things that are going to be expensive and hard?
Yeah. We have a couple questions from the audience. We have a general question, I think, that goes to all folks about filibuster reform and whether there is, at this point, any reasonable prospect that we could see it, and or whether such a fragile majority just makes it an impossibility. Any thoughts on that from anyone?
I'm not sure which
Your
way.
thought is that you wish Cal Cunningham hadn't had an affair, and maybe it wouldn't be as necessary to talk about.
That was-
Way outside of my line of expertise. I think, Rick, you're our expert on this one.
I mean, it's hopeful. I wouldn't bet that it's going to happen, but if ever there were a time to do it, now's the time to do it. Now is the time to do it. Because again, lessons learned over the past 4 years, there's just a spirit, as in we need to take advantage of this moment right now in terms of having the House, and let's work towards it. But we'll see.
Yeah. So right now, Joe Manchin is holding it up, right? Like, I mean, you don't have the support because Joe Manchin's not on board, and I'm not sure he necessarily wants to be on board, right? Because in some ways, I think in some ways because he's moderate, and in some ways because right now he's the kingmaker, right? Like, I mean, he essentially decides. So it's great for him. It's great for West Virginia. It's great for all that, right? So that's sort of the practical question. I have to say, I don't know. I'm really mixed on whether I would like filibuster reform. And I think the filibuster has all sorts of problems, and I don't want to go back to some sort of nostalgic vision in which we can kumbaya and find, a super majority, at least 10, across the aisle in a divided time. I understand all that, but there's a part of me that feels like there's already a shrinking sense of legitimacy of what Congress is doing or what the federal government is doing. I'm also really concerned about the courts, because in some ways, yes, the courts does whatever the courts do, but the courts also follow public opinion, right? And that's what they do. So if they see themselves as they're going to get aggressive anyway in striking down legislation, but I feel like that may sort of open the doors up. And then I don't know how that fight goes, right? Because it's one thing to say that, and I'm not necessarily happy with sort of, sort of this backlash that we have and whoever controls the federal government, right? We sort of just go one in another. But if the court starts coming down, the Supreme Court especially, and striking down and taking certain areas completely off the table, that's a little bit of a nuclear option, right? I mean, that's totally different than who's in political control. It's just outside. Campaign finance, that got taken off the table, right? They took a recent Second Amendment case. That may take a lot of fights that we have just off the table, right? So like, that's a totally different game. Now, it could be they will do whatever they want anyway, but I wonder whether or not, like, if it's seen that the congressional legitimacy is less and the battle lines are drawn. Anyway, the court system, I guess that leads to court packing, as a sort of the other side of the solution. I have no answer to that either, but I feel like there's a very dangerous game that everyone is sort of involved
I
in.
just remind people again, a learning opportunity. Why was the filibuster enacted anyway? Do your homework and look up filibuster in the racist history. Once again, the Southern voting bloc wanted power and they made demands, just like the Social Security Act, and why certain occupations were not allowed to participate in Social Security, as in domestic workers and farm workers who were predominantly African-American. So they couldn't participate in Social Security, which affects generational wealth. It's one thing when you have to take care of yourself and your children and help them to go to college and get their first home. It's another when you have to take care of your parents. That's 3 generations that you have to take care of. But again, this is policy. This is government policy that has worked to hold brown and black people back in this country. And that's the origins of the filibuster. And so, to Dr. Sue's point, who knows which way it's going to go, but do understand the history of why it exists, why it was born.
Amen. Greg, any further thoughts?
I'm not a political beast. Don't have anything to contribute to that one. Yeah,
That's all right. The other question we have is for you, Professor Sue, and we've kind of touched on the immigration crisis. And is there any degree of legitimate cause for calling the Democrats hypocritical for having, so vociferously attacked the Trump administration and now, in many respects, not changing a whole lot. At least in the
Yeah,
short
yeah.
term.
I mean, I think that criticism is legitimate, and certainly Biden is getting seriously attacked from the progressive left on all his immigration policies, right? Like I said, there were a lot of things that were easy to be done. Trump did a lot, so there were a lot that were easily unwound. But there's a lot that in some ways is outside of his control, or that he can't actually do anything necessarily quickly. I will say this, right? Like, so, some of the deterrent factors that the Trump administration were doing, actively separating families and then keeping them both in detention under a zero sort of tolerance policy, that's not what's leading to the effect right now, right? The biggest issue with the detention right now is that they're unaccompanied minors, and we don't know who to place them with, right? And that becomes a major issue. Going against sort of standard Trump policy, most families, if they arrive as a family, are not being separated, and they are being, after some processing, though the processing is commonly getting overwhelmed too, are being released. That's not great either, right? I mean, that has its own issues, right? Because it takes so long to actually get through the asylum claim. On the other hand, I think it's definitely true. I think, like, Biden is getting attacked from the left. I think he argues, or his minister argues, there's good reason for that, why they have to do and why it's different. But I can understand that criticism.
I've just put in the chat, Associated Press has done an analysis of Biden's first 100 days, where he stands on key promises. And one of the areas they look at pretty good detail is immigration. And they list 7 or 8 things he's done, and another maybe 8 or 9 that are only partly done, and another one that's been blocked by the courts. So it's clearly a long way to go. I feel like maybe, Catherine, we're kind of getting to the end of our time here. I wonder if there are any final last words from our panelists about the first 100 days and where we go from here. Are you all pretty much talked out?
I'll just say to the students, stay encouraged, stay encouraged. It's wonderful that you're studying politics. I think everything is political. Don't feel that you have to follow what your parents or your grandparents, said that you need to believe. Continue to explore, find out what you're really rooted in, what your values are, but stay hopeful. And thank you for being here tonight.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you to Catherine for organizing this and for everybody attending. I think these are important issues that it's really essential for people to be informed on and to think about. And the folks that are on this call are going to be the leaders of tomorrow, and you're going to be the people that have to carry the torch on these issues and how society deals with them. So yeah, please stay informed.
Yeah, one thing I have to say is that there's 100 days, even that it's kind of a respite. It's just a lot quieter, just than the last 4 years, and certainly the initial 100 days. So in some ways, the fact that we're having sort of reflections, and I had to actually look into what has been happening as opposed to just being blasted with it, right, is sort of interesting. The second thing might be sort of strange, but it's something I encourage, which is, certainly I think it's important to look at Biden and what the federal government's doing, and we should be paying attention to that. But I think, all of us should not forget state and local politics, where a lot of action is happening as well. And oftentimes is areas in which we can make a difference in a way that we may not necessarily have the ears of our senator or our Congress people at the federal level. And then we shouldn't forget that actually a lot of very important things are happening in state and federal local laws right now. And a lot of things that we're considering the federal level started at the state and local level.
Let me just say, picking up on what Dr. Stroman said about the experience of college and opening your eyes. For me, the most important political event in my life was meeting my roommate in college, who ended up being my roommate in undergraduate years, who is now a labor lawyer in New York. And the late night bull sessions we had debating the politics of that time and that era were the most important event in my college career, and had the most to do with making me into a person who's pursued a 40-year career in law and journalism. So stay engaged. Yeah, have those arguments and late night debates with your roommates and friends, and whenever you can. Sometimes it may have to be online, but yeah, I want to echo that. Stay engaged. Guess that's all we got, Catherine.
Yes, thank you everyone for being here tonight. I really enjoyed listening to y'all's thoughts on these very pressing issues, and just want to let everyone know we'll be posting a recording of the event, so feel free to watch it again or share it with anyone who might have missed the event. Thank you so much.
Thank you.